A scruffy stray cat begs for food through the window out of hunger. What truly happens when a lonely woman saves a shivering stray from the cold? You might expect a simple story of rescue, but prepare yourself for an unexpected twist, revealing a hidden connection that changes everything you thought you knew about Yellow Cat's arrival at Martha's window. Subscribe, like, and listen now to experience the full story and uncover the surprising truth in meowing at the window. The frantic scrabbling against the glass was the first thing that pierced the quiet hum of the refrigerator. Then came the sound, a desperate, strangled cry that was less a meow and more a raw of air. Martha dropped her spoon, the lukewarm tomato soup sloshing over the rim of the bowl onto the worn floral tablecloth. Outside, the November wind howled, rattling the old window frames of her small suburban house, a sound she usually found comforting in its familiarity. Tonight, it sounded like a predator's growl. She froze, listening. It came again, louder this time, accompanied by a frantic thud against the lower pane, not the polite tap of a neighbor, nor the rhythmic scratching of bare branches. This was panic, pure unadulterated terror hurled against her window pane, pushing her chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the linoleum. Martha moved toward the window, overlooking the dark, wind-swept backyard. The thin curtains did little to obscure the chaos erupting just beyond the glass. A flash of movement, low to the ground. A blur of what looked like dirty gold fur slammed against the window again, claws screeching futilely on the smooth surface. And behind it, a deeper shadow, low and menacing teeth, bared in the faint light spilling from her kitchen. A dog, large, dark, its shape indistinct, but its intent terrifyingly clear. It lunged, barking a deep, vicious sound that vibrated through the glass. The smaller creature, a cat she now realized impossibly thin and ragged, recoiled, pressing itself flat against the cold pane, its eyes wide and luminous, with primal fear staring directly into hers. Another lunge from the dog, its muzzle hitting the glass near the cat's head. The cat yowled, a heartbreaking sound of sheer desperation. It scrabbled again, a frantic, doomed attempt to claw through the barrier, separating it from the perceived safety within Martha's breath caught in her throat. The scene was brutal, immediate, unfolding inches from her face. The dog barked again, frustrated, then seemed to hesitate, perhaps sensing the unnatural barrier or hearing something else in the wind. It snarled one last time, cast a dark look towards the trembling feline pinned against the glass, and then melted back into the churning shadows of the yard, the sound of its heavy paws fading on the damp grass. Silence descended, broken only by the wind and the ragged, wheezing breaths of the creature still plastered against her window, its fur matted and dull ruffled in the gale. It didn't move, didn't look away from her, its green eyes stark against the grimy fur, holding an appeal so profound, so drenched in terror and exhaustion, it felt like a physical blow. The moment stretched, suspended between the violence that had just passed and the uncertainty of what came next. All Martha knew was the chilling image of those eyes burning through the glass, demanding something. The cat pressed against the window wasn't just any stray. He had a history, a life before the gnawing hunger and the constant, exhausting vigilance of the streets. 4 years ago, he'd been known simply as Sonny, a fitting name for the sleek, golden-furred cat, whose days were filled with warmth and affection. He'd belonged to the Miller family, living in a bustling house just a few blocks away from where he now trembled. His world had been soft beds, predictable meal times filled with choice cuts of tuna or chicken, and the gentle hands of Emily Miller, a young girl who adored him. He'd purr for hours nestled in her lap, the picture of feline contentment. His coat had shone like polished gold, his green eyes sparkled with playful mischief, and the concept of hunger was utterly foreign. The foundation of that idyllic life crumbled the day Mr. Miller, Emily's father and the family's anchor, died suddenly from a heart attack. Grief shattered the household, Mrs. Miller, overwhelmed and struggling financially and emotionally, made the difficult decision to move herself and Emily into a small apartment across town, one that strictly prohibited pets. Amidst the chaos of packing tears and rushed goodbyes, Sonny found himself overlooked, then forgotten. One cold morning, the door closed for the last time, leaving him sitting on the porch of an empty house, confused and alone. The family didn't intentionally abandon him. In their pain and disarray, he simply slipped through the cracks. The first few weeks were a blur of bewildered searching. He'd waited by the door, then prowled the perimeter of the empty house, his familiar meows turning plaintive, then fading into silence. Hunger, a novel and terrifying sensation, began its relentless assault. Instinct kicked in raw and untrained. He learned to hunt clumsy, at first missing more mice than he caught. He discovered the grim bounty of overturned trash cans, the territorial aggression of other strays, the casual cruelty of some humans, and the unexpected kindness of others. He learned the rhythm of the suburbs, the schedules of garbage trucks, the houses with leaky hoses providing water, the yards with easily startled birds. His once shining coat became dull, matted, and scarred from fights over scraps or territory. His bright eyes grew wary, constantly scanning for danger. He became Yellow Cat, a survivor, etched thin by hardship, a ghost haunting the edges of the life he once knew. He carried the faint memory of warmth and touch like a phantom limb. Tonight had been particularly brutal. A freezing rain had started earlier, turning the fallen leaves into a slick, treacherous carpet. The usual garbage cans had been meager, already raided by raccoons, or secured tightly against the worsening weather. Driven by a hunger that felt like claws scraping the inside of his empty stomach, he'd ventured closer to the houses, drawn by the smells of cooking dinners. That's when the dog, a notoriously aggressive neighborhood brute left carelessly unleashed, had spotted him. The chase was swift, brutal, and terrifyingly one-sided. Yellow Cat ran on pure adrenaline, dodging cars skidding on wet pavement, his lungs burning until he saw the light in Martha's kitchen window, a beacon in the terrifying dark. He hadn't chosen her house specifically. It was simply the nearest point of apparent refuge when the dog cornered him against the backyard fence. Slamming against the glass was a last desperate gamble born of pure panic. Inside, Martha Henderson stood rooted to the spot, the image of the cat's terrified eyes seared into her mind. She was 72, widowed for nearly 15 years, her children grown and living states away. Her days followed a quiet, predictable pattern, tending her small garden in warmer months, reading, watching old movies, and preparing simple meals for one. Her own cat, a fluffy gray Persian named Mittens, had been her constant companion for 16 years, her silent confidant through the lonely evenings after her husband George passed. Mittens had died peacefully in her sleep 3 years ago, leaving a void Martha hadn't thought she could fill again. The silence in the house had become heavier since then. Seeing the raw fear in the stray's eyes, the wet, shivering misery of its thin body unlocked something in her. It wasn't just pity. It was a sharp pang of recognition, an echo of her own loneliness, and a fierce, unexpected surge of protectiveness. The memory of Mittens, soft and warm, surfaced, not with pain this time, but with a gentle nudge. The dog was gone. The immediate danger had passed, but the cat remained plastered against the glass, looking utterly broken. Hesitation warred with impulse, taking in a stray especially. One looking so rough was a responsibility. It meant vet bills, uncertainty, potential heartbreak, but leaving it out there in the freezing rain after witnessing its terror, that felt impossible. Taking a deep breath, the decision solidified. Martha walked purposefully toward the back door. This was the inciting incident, the choice that would reroute the quiet stream of her life. She turned the deadbolt, her hand steady, and pulled the door open a crack into the howling wind, breaking the barrier between her quiet solitude and the desperate creature outside. The blast of cold, wet air that hit Yellow Cat when the door opened was almost enough to make him bolt. Years of street survival screamed trap, his muscles bunched ready to flee back into the relative, albeit dangerous, familiarity of the shadows. But the dog was gone, the immediate threat vanished, and the exhaustion was bone deep. More than that, the sliver of warmth emanating from the opening, carrying the faint, almost forgotten scent of a human dwelling, held a powerful allure. He remained frozen, half pressed against the siding. Now watching the woman through the gap, Martha didn't move towards him. She simply held the door slightly ajar, her expression unreadable in the dim porch light. Then slowly, she backed away into the kitchen, leaving the door open about a foot. Yellow Cat watched, his green eyes tracking her every movement. He saw her move towards the counter, heard the clink of ceramic, the splash of liquid. The scent that wafted out now was different. Warm milk. It was a primal memory, faint but deeply resonant. His stomach cramped with a hunger so intense it was painful. Still, he hesitated. Trust was a luxury he couldn't afford. He scanned the yard again, ears twitching, testing the wind for any hint of the dog's return or other dangers. Nothing. The wind cut through his damp fur, making him shiver violently. The warmth from the kitchen beckoned. Taking a tentative step, then another, he crept towards the opening, low to the ground, ready to dart away at the slightest provocation. He poked his head through the gap, his whiskers brushing against the doorframe. The kitchen was bathed in a soft yellow light. It smelled of old wood, lingering soup, and now overwhelmingly of warm milk and something else. Fish. Martha had placed a shallow bowl of milk near the doorway, along with a small plate containing flakes of tuna she'd found in the back of her pantry, remnants of a casserole she'd made weeks ago. She now stood very still by the kitchen table, deliberately not looking directly at him, giving him space. Yellow Cat darted inside, grabbed a mouthful of tuna with a speed born of desperation, and retreated back to the threshold, half in, half out, wolfing it down. His eyes never left Martha. He repeated the maneuver, snatching another piece of fish, then lapping quickly at the milk, the warmth spreading through his chilled body. He ate with a frantic energy, glancing towards the door every few seconds, his body coiled like a spring. He finished the fish and most of Rala milk quickly, the small offering barely taking the edge off his profound hunger. But it was more than he'd had in days. Licking his lips, the immediate panic slightly subsided, replaced by a profound weariness. He looked around the kitchen properly for the first time. It was small, tidy, but old-fashioned. Worn linoleum, faded floral wallpaper, a sturdy wooden table. It felt safe, safer than anywhere he'd been in a long, long time. He saw a rag rug by the stove radiating a faint warmth. Hesitantly, he padded over to it, circled once, and collapsed onto the worn fabric, tucking his paws beneath his thin body. He didn't relax, not completely, but the shivering began to subside, replaced by a deep exhaustion. He watched Martha through slitted eyes as she quietly cleaned up her spilled soup. She didn't approach him, didn't try to touch him. She just moved with a quiet deliberateness that was oddly calming. Finally, she sat back down at the table, picking up a book. The silence returned, but this time it felt different, companionable almost. Yellow Cat closed his eyes just for a second, the longest he'd dared to in what felt like an eternity. The next few days established a tentative routine. Martha would leave food and fresh water near the back door, initially just inside, then gradually moving it further into the kitchen. Yellow Cat, whom she started calling Goldie, in her mind, hoping the name might polish away some of his scruffiness, remained wary. He spent most of his time on the rag rug, a small tensed knot of fur bolting for the door if she moved too suddenly or made a loud noise. He wouldn't let her touch him, flinching away if her hand came near. But he didn't leave. The regular meals, the warmth, the absence of immediate danger, it was a powerful combination. He started exploring the kitchen at night when Martha was asleep, sniffing cautiously at cupboards, jumping onto counters with silent grace, mapping this new small territory. Complications soon arose. Her next-door neighbor, Mr. Henderson, no relation, a source of constant male mix-ups. A fastidious man whose prize-winning roses were his pride and joy, spotted Yellow Cat, sunning himself warily on Martha's back steps one afternoon. He marched over later that day, his face pinched with disapproval. "Martha," he began without preamble, "I see you've acquired a visitor, a rather mangy-looking one, if I might say." Martha, who was weeding her small vegetable patch, straightened up, wiping her brow. "He needed help, Walter. He won't bother anyone. Strays carry diseases." Walter sniffed. "And fleas. They dig up gardens. There are ordinances, you know. Animal control." He let the threat hang in the air. Martha felt a prickle of annoyance, quickly followed by a spike of fear. Animal control. That meant a cage uncertainty, potentially euthanasia. If he wasn't deemed adoptable, given his condition and fearfulness, he's staying close to the house, she said firmly. He's not causing any trouble. Walter just humphed, "See that he doesn't." The encounter left Martha unsettled. She looked at Yellow Cat, now watching them from the steps with wary eyes, and felt a renewed determination. She couldn't let him be taken away, but Walter's words about disease and fleas also struck a chord of practicality. The cat was terribly thin, his coat dull and patchy, and he occasionally scratched himself vigorously. He needed proper care. Another complication arrived in the form of a large, swaggering ginger tomcat with one torn ear and an air of undisputed ownership of the neighborhood's alleys. He appeared one evening, a silent orange menace perched on Martha's back fence, staring down at Yellow Cat, who was nervously eating his dinner on the porch. Yellow Cat froze, flattening himself, a low growl rumbling in his chest. A sound Martha hadn't heard before. The ginger tomcat simply stared, radiating territorial aggression. He didn't attack, not yet, but the message was clear. This is my domain. Yellow Cat finished his meal, hastily darting back inside, casting fearful glances over his shoulder. The ginger menace became a recurring presence, a silent orange threat lurking at the edges of Yellow Cat's fragile new sanctuary. Then a fierce late autumn storm blew in, rattling the house with gale-force winds and horizontal sheets of rain. The power flickered, plunging the kitchen into momentary darkness. Before the emergency lights on the microwave blinked on, Yellow Cat, startled by the noise and the sudden dark shot under the kitchen table, eyes wide. The storm raged all night. Martha watched him, huddled and trembling, clearly battling the deep-seated instinct to flee into the wild unknown versus the nascent trust he was beginning to place in this strange shelter. She spoke to him softly, reassuringly, not trying to coax him out, just letting him hear her calm voice over the roar of the wind. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind broken branches and a sodden landscape. Yellow Cat was still under the table, but he seemed marginally less terrified. He crept out for his breakfast, casting wary looks at the rain-streaked window, but he stayed. It felt like a small victory, a subtle deepening of the tentative bond between them. The stakes were rising. Keeping him safe wasn't just about food and shelter anymore. It involved neighbors, other animals, his own deep-seated trauma, and Martha's growing emotional investment. The uneasy truce held for another week. Yellow Cat grew bolder, venturing out from the kitchen into the small hallway and occasionally peering into the living room, though he'd retreat quickly if Martha was there. He still wouldn't tolerate touch, but he no longer bolted every time she entered the kitchen. He'd even started responding just barely to the soft, low voice she used when she spoke to him, his ears twitching slightly in her direction. He was still painfully thin, but the regular food was starting to make a small difference. His movements seemed less driven by frantic energy, more by cautious curiosity. The rag rug by the stove remained his primary base, his island of relative safety. The turning point came unexpectedly and violently. One crisp afternoon, Martha heard a sudden explosion of horrific cat sounds from the backyard. The high-pitched, shrieking, spitting, and deep-throated yowling of a serious fight. Her heart leaped into her throat. Grabbing the broom, leaning against the back door, she flung it open and rushed out. The scene confirmed her fears. Yellow Cat was locked in a furious battle with the ginger tomcat. Fur flew as they rolled across the damp lawn, a tumbling vortex of claws and teeth. The ginger cat was larger, heavier, clearly more experienced in these brutal street brawls. Yellow Cat, though fighting with desperate ferocity, was clearly getting the worst of it. "Get out of here!" "Shoo!" Martha yelled, waving the broom frantically. She didn't dare get too close, afraid of being caught in the crossfire, but the sudden appearance of the large, noisy human was enough to startle the ginger Tom. He gave Yellow Cat one last vicious swipe, then disengaged, bounding effortlessly over the fence and disappearing into the neighbor's yard, leaving Yellow Cat lying panting and bleeding on the grass. Martha rushed over. Yellow Cat tried to scramble away, hissing weakly, but he couldn't put weight on his front leg. Blood matted the fur on his shoulder and flank, and a nasty scratch ran dangerously close to his eye. Seeing him injured, vulnerable, his hard-won progress threatened, solidified everything for Martha: pity, responsibility, affection. It all coalesced into a fierce, unwavering resolve. This wasn't just a stray she was feeding anymore. This was her cat. "Oh, you poor thing," she murmured, her voice thick with concern. "We need to get you help." Getting him help, however, was a monumental challenge. He was injured, terrified, and deeply distrustful of being handled, let alone confined. Martha knew she couldn't do it alone. Swallowing her pride, she first retrieved her thickest gardening gloves and an old, sturdy laundry basket from the shed. Then, heart pounding, she did something she rarely did. She knocked on Mr. Henderson's door. Walter Henderson opened the door, his expression shifting from mild surprise to distinct disapproval as he took in Martha, slightly disheveled and holding the laundry basket. "Martha, is there a problem?" "Walter, I need your help," she said, keeping her voice steady. "The cat, Goldie, he's been hurt badly by that big ginger tomcat. I need to get him to the vet, and I can't catch him alone." Walter looked skeptical. "Martha, I told you about strays." "He's not just a stray anymore, Walter." Martha interrupted, a surprising firmness in her voice. "He lives here now, and he's hurt. Please." Perhaps it was the desperation in her voice, or the genuine distress in her eyes, or maybe just a flicker of buried neighborly duty. But Walter hesitated, then sighed. "All right, Martha. All right. Let me get my work gloves." The capture was stressful. Yellow Cat, despite his injuries, reverted to full feral panic mode. He hissed, spat, and tried to drag himself under the porch bushes when they approached. It took both Martha, speaking soothingly while trying to gently herd him and Walter, surprisingly adept with the laundry basket, to finally corner him and coax him inside. He thrashed wildly for a moment, rattling the plastic, his eyes wide with terror, before collapsing into a trembling heap. In the corner of the basket, Martha quickly secured the lid, her own hands shaking. The visit to the vet was eye-opening. Dr. Ramirez, a kind, practical woman, examined Yellow Cat gently but thoroughly. She confirmed he was severely underweight, likely suffering from malnutrition and parasites from his time on the streets. The fight wounds were cleaned and stitched. A deep puncture on his shoulder, several long scratches, and a concerning swelling around his injured leg, though thankfully no bones were broken. He'd also need antibiotics and flea treatment. Dr. Ramirez estimated he was around 5 years old, confirming Martha's guess based on his history. "He's been through a lot," Dr. Ramirez said, looking at Martha over her glasses as Yellow Cat, now sedated and bandaged, rested in a carrier. "He's lucky he found you. Taking on a stray, especially one this traumatized, is a big commitment. Martha, are you prepared for that?" Looking at the sleeping cat, his ragged golden fur partially shaved around his bandages, Martha didn't hesitate. The fear, the expense, which was significant, making a noticeable dent in her fixed income, the uncertainty, none of it mattered as much as the simple fact that this creature needed her. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong, "he has a home now." This was the turning point. For Martha, the decision was made, the point of no return crossed. She was no longer just offering temporary shelter. She was offering permanence, commitment, love, regardless of the cost or difficulty. She was actively fighting for him and for Yellow Cat. Though he couldn't consciously understand the vet visit or Martha's declaration, something shifted too. Waking up later, hazy from the sedation, but safe within the confines of the carrier, back in the quiet warmth of Martha's kitchen, perhaps some primal part of him sensed the change. He was injured, yes, but he had been cared for. He hadn't been abandoned again. The pain medication eased his physical agony, and for the first time sheltered and tended to a flicker of something other than fear, perhaps nascent trust, perhaps simple acceptance, began to stir within him. He was no longer just reacting to survive. He was in a place where healing, both physical and perhaps emotional, might actually be possible. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The weeks following the vet visit marked a period of slow, fragile healing for Yellow Cat, and a deepening bond between him and Martha. Confined initially to a large dog crate Dr. Ramirez had lent Martha to ensure he rested his injured leg, Yellow Cat was forced into closer proximity with his human caregiver than ever before. Martha meticulously administered his antibiotics, cleverly hidden in small morsels of cooked chicken or fish, cleaned his wounds as instructed, and changed the bedding in his crate daily. She spent hours sitting near the crate, reading aloud from her books, or simply talking to him in a low, calm voice, narrating her day, sharing memories of Mittens, never forcing interaction, but making her presence a constant, gentle reassurance. At first, Yellow Cat remained withdrawn and suspicious, retreating to the back of the crate whenever she approached. He ate the food, accepted the medication hidden within it, but flinched from her touch. Gradually, however, the routine, the quiet care, and the absence of threats began to penetrate his layers of fear. He started watching her more intently, his green eyes losing some of their frantic wariness. One crisp morning, as Martha reached in to place his breakfast bowl, her fingers brushed against his flank. Instead of recoiling, he merely stiffened for a moment, then relaxed slightly. It was a minuscule shift, but it felt monumental. A few days later, while Martha was murmuring quietly nearby, a low rumble started deep in Yellow Cat's chest. It was a hesitant, rusty sound, unfamiliar even to him after years of silence or hissing. A purr. Martha froze, holding her breath. The purr continued soft and tentative as he watched her with half-closed eyes. Tears welled in Martha's eyes. It was the first definitive sign that the frightened stray was beginning to feel not just safe, but perhaps even content. Once his leg healed sufficiently, Dr. Ramirez gave the okay for him to have more freedom. Martha opened the crate door, unsure what to expect. Yellow Cat poked his head out cautiously, surveyed the kitchen, his familiar territory. And then, instead of darting back to his old spot on the rag rug, he took a few hesitant steps towards Martha, who was sitting at the table. He stopped a few feet away, looked up at her, and gave a soft, questioning meow, entirely different from the desperate cries at the window weeks earlier. Martha slowly extended her hand, palm down. He watched it, sniffed the air, then took another step forward and tentatively rubbed his cheek against her outstretched fingers. His fur, though still somewhat patchy, felt surprisingly soft, where it was growing back clean and healthy. Martha felt a profound sense of joy and relief wash over her. The wall of fear was finally beginning to crumble. With his growing confidence came a blossoming personality. He began exploring the rest of the small house. The living room, with its comfortable armchair that caught the afternoon sun, the quiet hallway, even daring to peek into Martha's bedroom. He discovered the joy of batting at dust motes, dancing in sunbeams, the simple pleasure of stretching out languidly in a patch of warmth. He started following Martha from room to room, a silent golden shadow often settling down near her, though still preferring a slight distance. The purr became more frequent, a rumbling affirmation of his slowly returning sense of security. He was still jumpy at loud noises, still wary of sudden movements, but the transformation was undeniable. He was becoming a cat again, not just a survivor. However, the peace was fragile, threatened by forces beyond the cozy confines of Martha's house. Walter Henderson, while grudgingly helpful during the emergency, remained skeptical. He'd make pointed comments about the lingering stray smell, or ask pointedly if Martha had gotten his shots yet, his disapproval a constant low-level pressure. Martha deflected his comments politely but firmly, her resolve to protect Yellow Cat unwavering. A more immediate threat resurfaced one frosty evening. Yellow Cat was sitting on the back steps, enjoying the crisp air, when the ginger tomcat reappeared bolder this time. He didn't just perch on the fence. He dropped silently into the yard, stalking slowly towards the house, tail-twitching eyes fixed on Yellow Cat. Yellow Cat flattened himself on the steps, fur bristling, a low growl building in his throat. He was healthier now, stronger, but the ginger tom was still larger and carried the intimidating aura of the dominant male. Martha saw the confrontation brewing through the kitchen window. Her instinct was to rush out, chase the ginger cat away again, but she hesitated. Yellow Cat needed to establish this as his territory, his safe space. Interfering every time might undermine his growing confidence. But the fear of him getting hurt again was palpable. The standoff stretched for long minutes, the tension crackling in the twilight air. The ginger tom took another step forward, lowering his head, emitting a menacing yowl. Yellow Cat held his ground, hissing fiercely, refusing to back down. Just as it seemed a fight was inevitable. Martha deliberately opened the back door, a crack making a slight noise. The unexpected sound, the reminder of the human presence associated with this territory, seemed to give the ginger tom pause. He hesitated, glanced towards the door, then seemed to decide it wasn't worth the fight today. With a final dismissive flick of his tail, he turned and leaped back over the fence, disappearing as quickly as he'd arrived. Yellow Cat watched him go, still tense but victorious in this small skirmish. He turned and darted back inside, rubbing against Martha's legs with unusual force, purring loudly, a mixture of relief and perhaps pride. This encounter highlighted the ongoing vulnerability. The ginger tom would be back. Walter's disapproval simmered, and underlying it all was Martha's own quiet worry. She wasn't young anymore. Her health was generally good, but arthritis stiffened her joints on cold mornings, and she sometimes felt breathless after exertion. What would happen to Yellow Cat if something happened to her? He was becoming her companion, her reason for structuring her days, a warm presence against the chill of loneliness. The thought of him ending up back on the streets, or worse, was unbearable. This period became a dark night of the soul for Martha, wrestling with these fears, even as she cherished Yellow Cat's progress. She began researching local no-kill shelters just in case, tucking the information away grimly. She checked her fences, ensuring there were no obvious gaps. She made sure Yellow Cat wore the simple collar and tag Dr. Ramirez had provided, clearly marking him as owned, not stray. She was preparing consciously and subconsciously for the inevitable final test, the event that would solidify Yellow Cat's place in this home or shatter the fragile peace they had built. The tension was escalating. The final confrontation, in whatever form it took, felt imminent. The final confrontation arrived not with a bang, but with the stealthy tread of the ginger tomcat on a cold, clear night under a full moon. Martha had just let Yellow Cat out for his usual evening patrol of the small fenced backyard before settling in for the night. She stood by the back door watching him, a familiar ritual that had become part of their routine. The air was sharp and still carrying sounds. Clearly, Yellow Cat moved with a newfound confidence, sniffing along the fence line, his tail held high, a stark contrast to the terrified creature who had huddled there weeks ago. Suddenly, he froze. His body went rigid, ears, flattened tail puffed out. A low growl vibrated in his chest. Martha followed his gaze towards the shadowy corner near the old oak tree. Emerging from the darkness, bold as brass, was the ginger tomcat. He didn't hesitate at the fence this time. He strode directly into the center of the yard, planting himself firmly, issuing a low, challenging yowl. This wasn't a tentative probe. This was a direct invasion, a clear challenge for dominance of the territory. Yellow Cat didn't back down, bolstered by weeks of security. Good food and Martha's quiet presence, he stood his ground. He arched his back, his golden fur seeming to stand on end, making him appear larger. He answered the Ginger Tom's yowl with a fierce hiss that promised retaliation. Martha's heart pounded. Her first instinct was to interfere, to grab the broom, to shout. But she remembered her earlier hesitation. This fight, she sensed, was inevitable. Yellow Cat needed to claim this space, his home, for himself. Taking a deep breath, she stayed by the door, a silent, watchful guardian. The two cats circled each other low to the ground, muscles bunched, tails lashing. The air crackled with imminent violence. The Ginger Tom, relying on his size and established dominance, made the first move, lunging forward with a swipe of his claws. Yellow Cat, quicker and more agile now that he was healthier, dodged sideways, darting in with a rapid bite to the Ginger's flank before retreating. The fight was on. It was a terrifying whirlwind of fur claws and spitting fury under the cold moonlight. Unlike the first fight, Yellow Cat wasn't just defending desperately. He was fighting strategically, using his agility to counter the larger cat's brute force. He absorbed blows, but he landed them too quick, scratches, nipping bites. He knew this yard, now every bush, every dip in the lawn. He used the terrain, darting behind Martha's dormant rose bushes, forcing the Ginger Tom into awkward corners. Martha watched, hands clenched, murmuring encouragement under her breath. "Come on, Goldie, you can do it." The fight surged towards the back steps, dangerously close to Martha. The Ginger Tom pinned Yellow Cat, briefly trying to bring his weight to bear. But Yellow Cat twisted violently, raking his claws across the Ginger's nose. The Tom yowled in pain and surprise, momentarily stunned. Seizing the opportunity, Yellow Cat launched himself forward, not with aggression, but with a solid, determined shove, knocking the Ginger Tom off balance. He then stood his ground directly in front of the back door, his territory's heart puffing himself up, emitting a deep, guttural growl that sounded utterly definitive. "This is my home, mine." The Ginger Tomcat, bleeding from the nose, momentarily disoriented, and perhaps sensing the unwavering presence of the human and the fierce determination of the Golden Cat, seemed to finally concede defeat. The cost of continuing the fight outweighed the benefit. He shook his head, cast one last resentful look at Yellow Cat, and then with a final disgruntled flick of his tail, he turned and slunk away, leaping over the fence and vanishing into the night. Yellow Cat stood panting, adrenaline coursing through him, watching until the rival was truly gone. Then he turned, looked up at Martha by the door, and let out a single shaky meow. Martha opened the door wider, her own relief immense. "You did it, Goldie," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "You brave boy." Yellow Cat limped slightly as he walked inside, adrenaline fading, revealing a few new scratches and a definite soreness. But he was fundamentally unharmed, victorious. He rubbed against her legs insistently, purring like a tiny motorboat, seeking comfort and reassurance after the intense battle. Martha gently checked him over, dabbing at a small scratch on his ear with antiseptic from the kit Dr. Ramirez had given her. He allowed her ministrations without protest, leaning into her touch. The fight seemed to have cemented not just his claim on the territory, but also his trust in Martha. He had defended his home, and she had been there, his silent backup, his anchor. In the days and weeks that followed, a deeper peace settled over the small house. The ginger tomcat was never seen in their yard again, respecting the newly established boundaries, Mr. Henderson perhaps noticing the lack of feline conflict, or maybe just mellowing with the approaching holidays, seemed to soften his stance, even offering a curt nod towards Yellow Cat one morning. The immediate external threats had subsided. Yellow Cat, now firmly established and secure, truly came into his own. He shed the last vestiges of the wary stray. His golden coat grew thick and glossy, his green eyes bright and alert, often crinkling in contentment. He claimed the worn armchair in the living room as his own, spending hours napping in the sunbeams that slanted across it. He developed routines, waking Martha with a gentle paw pat on her cheek, supervising her breakfast preparations from the counter, settling on the rug by the fireplace. A new electric one Martha had treated herself to. In the evenings, his purr a steady, comforting presence in the quiet house. He even began tentatively playing batting at dangling strings or chasing crumpled paper balls with surprising bursts of energy. Martha, too, found a new rhythm. The loneliness that had haunted her quiet house for years dissipated, replaced by the gentle companionship of her golden cat. Talking to him, caring for him, simply knowing he was there provided structure and warmth to her days. Her fears about the future hadn't vanished entirely, but they were tempered by the present joy and the undeniable resilience of the creature purring beside her. She updated the information for the no-kill shelter, adding a recent photo of Yellow Cat, now looking healthy and handsome, along with a heartfelt letter about his personality just in case. A responsible precaution born of love. The meowing at the window, once a sound of desperate hunger and terror, was now a distant memory. It had been replaced by the soft thud of Yellow Cat jumping onto the bed in the morning, the contented sigh as he settled onto her lap in the evening, the happy purr that vibrated through the quiet house. He was no longer Yellow Cat, the scruffy stray. He was Goldie, Martha's beloved companion, finally home his past, a healed scar beneath a coat of shining gold. They had saved each other, finding warmth and belonging in the quiet landscape of the American suburbs, proving that sometimes the most profound connections arrive unexpectedly, meowing at the window. They left a dead puppy at a gas station, but a stray cat did the unthinkable. Could a simple stray cat hold the key to saving a life? When a puppy is left for dead at a lonely gas station, you won't believe the shocking twist involving the station's aloof feline resident that defies all expectations. Subscribe, like, and listen now to uncover the heartwarming and thrilling full story. The rhythmic thump, thump, thump of the loose fan belt on the aging fuel pump was usually the loudest sound out here, miles from anywhere significant on a forgotten stretch of highway. cutting through the vast, indifferent plains of Nebraska. But tonight, it was drowned out by a sound far more alien and unsettling. A low, guttural growl, vibrating with an intensity George hadn't heard from the station's resident stray cat. In the 2 years the feline had unofficially bunked there. George, a man whose face was as weathered as the landscape, paused his nightly ritual of checking the pumps, the wrench in his hand, suddenly feeling heavy. The sound wasn't directed at him. It emanated from the shadowy corner near the overflowing dumpster and the stack of discarded tires, a spot usually avoided by anything wanting a quiet life. He squinted into the gloom, the single flickering fluorescent bulb overhead casting long, distorted shadows. Rusty, the orange tabby, whose independence George grudgingly respected, was a silhouette against the grimy concrete wall. But the cat wasn't alone. Its body was tense, crouched, low tail, twitching erratically. The growl intensified, morphing into a series of sharp hisses. And it wasn't directed at the usual nighttime scavengers, raccoons, or the occasional skunk Rusty seemed to be confronting. Nothing. No, wait. There was something else there, low in the shadows, obscured by a discarded cardboard box. George took a cautious step forward, his worn work boots crunching softly on the gravel. "Rusty, what's gotten into you, cat?" His voice was rough, unused to soothing tones. Rusty didn't flinch, didn't break his stare. If anything, the cat seemed to press closer to the box, positioning himself defensively between it and the approaching man. This was bizarre. Rusty tolerated. George accepted food occasionally, offered a fleeting leg rub, but protectiveness, defiance. Those weren't in his repertoire. Another sound reached George, then almost lost beneath Rusty's hissing. A faint, high-pitched whine, thin and reedy like wind, whistling through a crack. It wasn't the wind, it came from the box. George felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He'd seen enough ugliness dumped at the edges of lonely highways to last a lifetime. He braced himself, reaching slowly towards the box. Rusty hissed again, louder this time, a clear warning, "Don't touch it." But the whine, weak as it was spurred, George on. He nudged the box flap open with the toe of his boot, peering inside. His breath hitched, curled in the bottom. Barely visible amongst some oily rags was a tiny puppy. Its fur matted its body, terrifyingly still, except for the almost imperceptible rise and fall of its ribcage. And huddled right beside it, radiating a fierce, unexpected warmth and an even fiercer protectiveness, was Rusty. The stray cat wasn't just near the box. He was guarding its seemingly lifeless occupant. What in God's name was going on? The Sand Hill Serenity Gas and Go was anything but serene. It was a relic, a stubborn outpost clinging to existence on Highway 2, a route long bypassed by the interstate that hummed with real traffic. Miles to the south, George Harrison had run the place for 30 years, ever since coming back from a war that had etched lines onto his soul as surely as time had etched them onto his face. He was a man of routine, finding comfort in the familiar cycles of opening pumps, wiping windshields for the few travelers who still took the scenic route-checking inventory, and closing up under the vast star-dusted Nebraska sky. His interactions were brief, transactional. He wasn't unfriendly, just self-contained. The gas station, with its peeling paint and the perpetually half-stocked shelves inside, reflected its owner, functional, enduring, and profoundly solitary. Rusty had shown up 2 summers ago, a skinny orange blur darting from under a sputtering Winnebago. George hadn't intended to keep him. He'd left out a saucer of milk, then some scraps figuring the cat would move on. But Rusty hadn't. He'd established a cautious residency, maintaining a perimeter around the station, accepting George's offerings with dignified aloofness and disappearing whenever strangers approached. He was company. George hadn't realized he needed a silent, independent companion. In the echoing quiet, George maintained the fiction that Rusty was just passing through. But he bought cat food now and worried just a little when the tabby didn't show up for his evening meal. That evening, before the unsettling discovery by the dumpster, had been typical. A trucker hauling grain, a family in a minivan, asking for directions to a non-existent tourist trap. The setting sun, painting the endless sky in hues of orange and purple. George had locked the pumps, turned off the main lights, leaving only the single security bulb buzzing over the service bay. He was heading back to his small apartment attached to the station, anticipating leftovers and the crackle of the old radio, when Rusty's uncharacteristic behavior had stopped him cold. Now kneeling by the dumpster, the initial shock giving way to a grim understanding. George felt a familiar wave of weary anger wash over him. Dumping animals wasn't uncommon out here, far from watchful eyes. People drove out, rid themselves of an inconvenience, and sped away, leaving the creature to the elements. Or worse, he'd found kittens before, once even a cage of bewildered rabbits. Usually, they were already gone, victims of the cold, predators, or starvation. This puppy looked no different. Limp eyes closed cold to the touch despite Rusty's proximity. Dead or close enough to make no difference. That's what his pragmatic mind told him. Easier to just deal with it. A quick burial behind the station beside the others. Less heartache that way. He reached into the box again, gently pushing Rusty aside. The cat allowed it this time, though he remained close, watching George with unnerving intensity. George's fingers brushed against the puppy's fur. It was colder than it should be, but beneath the chill, beneath the stillness, he felt it, the faintest tremor, a shiver that ran through the tiny body. Then another, almost silent whine. It wasn't dead, not yet. He looked from the impossibly small creature to the stray cat, who was now tentatively licking the puppy's matted ear. Rusty, the aloof survivor, the ghost of the gas station, was trying to help, trying to comfort, trying to keep it warm. It defied logic, defied everything. George knew about the natural order of things out here, but the evidence was undeniable. Something shifted in George. Then the weariness remained, but the anger solidified into a different kind of resolve. Maybe it was the puppy's improbable spark of life. Maybe it was the cat's utterly unexpected display of empathy. Or maybe, after years of solitude and witnessing quiet cruelties, he just couldn't stand aside this time. He couldn't add another small mound to the lonely patch of ground behind the station. "All right, you too," he muttered, his voice thick. "All right." Carefully, gently, he lifted the fragile puppy from the box. It weighed almost nothing. He cradled it against his chest, feeling the feeble heartbeat against his own ribs. He turned towards the warmth and light of the station office, Rusty trailing silently, purposefully at his heels. The routine was broken. The quiet was shattered. Saving this puppy, this near impossible life, was now the only thing that mattered. The station office, usually smelling faintly of gasoline, stale coffee, and dust, now took on the air of a makeshift animal hospital. George cleared a space on the cluttered counter, laying down old, clean towels he kept for oil spills. he found a small dropper in a forgotten first aid kit and carefully mixed warm water with a touch of sugar. Remembering something he'd read once about shock getting the fluid into the puppy was painstaking. Its mouth was so small, its swallowing reflex weak. Lucky, the name seemed both hopeful and ironic, remained worryingly limp, though the warmth of the office and the towel wrap seemed to coax a slightly stronger shiver from its tiny frame. Rusty perched on a nearby stool, a silent orange sentinel. He watched every move George made, occasionally letting out a soft chirp as if offering encouragement or perhaps critique. When George managed to get a few drops of sugar water down Lucky's throat, Rusty seemed to relax, fractionally tucking his paws beneath his chest. The first 24 hours were critical. George barely slept, checking on the puppy every hour, gently massaging its limbs, trying to coax more fluid into it. He drove into the nearest town, a 40-mile round trip. First thing in the morning, leaving Rusty on high alert beside the makeshift incubator, a cardboard box lined with more towels and positioned near the office's ancient space heater. At the feed store, feeling slightly conspicuous, he bought puppy formula, a proper feeding bottle with tiny nipples, and a heat lamp usually reserved for chicks. The store owner, Martha, a woman whose pragmatic curiosity matched George's reticence, raised an eyebrow. New addition. George, she'd asked her tone-neutral, "Found him." George mumbled, unwilling to elaborate on the dumpster or the cat, near gone. Martha just nodded slowly. "Tough start. Needs round the clock. If he's that bad, you got the time." George just grunted, paid, and left. Did he have the time? The station demanded attention. Fuel deliveries needed signing for the odd customer still trickled in. But as he drove back, the image of Lucky's fragile form and Rusty's unwavering vigil filled his mind. He'd make the time. Back at the station, Lucky showed the first real sign of improvement. Alerted by the heat lamp's gentle glow, the puppy stirred, lifting its head fractionally and letting out a weak but definite yap. Rusty, who had apparently not moved from his post, immediately nudged the puppy with his nose. George felt a surge of cautious optimism. He prepared the formula, his large, calloused hands surprisingly adept with the tiny bottle. Lucky latched on weakly at first, then began to suckle with growing desperate strength. It was the most beautiful sound George had heard in years. Over the next week, a new routine settled over the sand hills, Serenity, Gas and Go. Lucky, fueled by regular feedings and the constant warmth, began to gain strength. His eyes opened, revealing curious, slightly unfocused blue depths. He started to wobble on unsteady paws, exploring the confines of his box. Then the floor of the office, always under Rusty's watchful gaze, the cat had fully embraced his role as guardian. He'd groom Lucky with rough, affectionate licks, curl up beside him for naps, and patiently tolerate the puppy's clumsy attempts at play nipping. George found himself smiling more, talking more, mostly to the animals. But the habit began to spill over. Regular customers noticed the change. "Here you got yourself a mascot, George," chuckled old Mr. Henderson, a farmer who stopped for gas twice a week. He peered into the office where Lucky was tumbling over Rusty's tail. "And look at that cat. Never thought I'd see the day Rusty let anything get that close." George just shrugged, a ghost of a smile playing on his lips. Keeps the place lively. But the fragile peace was shadowed by an unspoken question. Where had Lucky come from? Who would discard a puppy like trash? The thought nagged at George one afternoon while Lucky napped and Rusty sunned himself on the porch. George examined the cardboard box Lucky had been found in. It was plain unmarked, except for a greasy smudge, and tucked into a corner, folded a small torn piece of paper. It looked like a fragment of a receipt or label. Most of it was illegible, but George could make out a partial logo, something agricultural, maybe a feed brand or fertilizer, and a few faded letters, El Cray. He tucked the fragment into his wallet, a vague unease settling over him. It was probably nothing, just debris, but the memory of the battered pickup truck speeding away into the night lingered. Someone had abandoned Lucky. What if they came back? Or what if the puppy had belonged to someone who was actually looking for him? The complications beyond just keeping the creature alive began to surface. The unease solidified a few days later. A dusty blue pickup, vaguely familiar in its decrepitude, pulled up to the pumps. Not the same one as that night, but similar enough to prickle George's attention. A man got out, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed too close together. He bought gas, paid in cash, and his gaze lingered on the office door where Lucky had just let out an enthusiastic yap. "Cute pup," the man said, his voice flat. "Where'd you get him?" George felt a chill despite the afternoon sun. "Found him," he replied evenly, keeping his tone neutral. The man nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the station grounds before getting back into his truck. He didn't drive off immediately, just sat there for a minute, looking towards the office again, then finally pulled away, heading west. George watched him go, the knot in his stomach tightening again. It might be paranoia, it might be nothing, but something told him this quiet sanctuary he'd accidentally created for himself, a cat and a puppy, might not remain undisturbed for long. The world he'd tried to keep at bay was starting to intrude. Life settled into a semblance of normalcy, punctuated by the rhythms of the gas station and the growing antics of Lucky. The puppy was thriving. His coat, once matted and dull, now shone with health, a fluffy mix of white and black patches. He'd discovered the joy of chasing blowing leaves, the challenge of trying to herd Rusty, who tolerated it with amused disdain, and the absolute bliss of curling up on George's lap while the old man listened to the radio in the evenings. George found himself talking to Lucky, constantly narrating his day, explaining the workings of the pumps, sharing stories he hadn't thought about in years. The puppy was an eager, non-judgmental audience. The bond between the three of them, man, cat, and dog, felt surprisingly solid unexpectedly. Right, George had even taken Lucky for a proper checkup with Doc Evans, the veterinarian in the next county over. Doc Evans, a man whose gentle hands belied his gruff exterior, confirmed Lucky was a hardy little mutt, likely some kind of terrier mix, and pronounced him remarkably healthy. Given his start, he'd listened patiently to George's edited version of Lucky's discovery, omitting the dumpster and Rusty's initial vigil feeling strangely protective of the cat's role. "Well, George," Doc Evans had said, giving Lucky a final scratch behind the ears, "looks like you got yourself a dog. Doing a good job with him." The simple words filled George with a quiet pride he hadn't felt in a long time. He started thinking about the future. Lucky couldn't stay confined to the small office forever. Maybe fix up the fence around the small patch of grass behind the station, get him a proper doghouse. The thoughts were tentative, but they were there. He was no longer just rescuing the puppy. He was building a life with him. Then, one quiet Tuesday afternoon, The dusty blue pickup truck returned. George recognized it instantly, his stomach plummeting. The same gaunt man got out, but this time he wasn't alone. Another man emerged from the passenger side, shorter, stockier, with a mean set to his jaw. They didn't head for the pumps. They walked straight towards the office door, purpose in their stride. Lucky, alerted by the unfamiliar truck, started barking excitedly from inside his high-pitched yaps, echoing slightly. Rusty, who had been dozing on the counter, instantly went rigid, his ears flattened, a low growl rumbling in his chest. George stepped out of the service bay, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag, positioning himself between the approaching men and the office. "Can I help you?" George asked, his voice carefully level, though his heart was hammering against his ribs. The gaunt man stopped a few feet away. "Yeah, we're here for the dog." George stiffened. "This dog, that's the one." The stocky man chimed in, his voice rough. "Belongs to my cousin here. Little runt went missing a few weeks back. Looks like he ended up here." George's mind raced, missing or dumped. He remembered the condition. Lucky was in the cold, the near-death state. He was abandoned. George stated flatly, left for dead by the dumpsters. The gaunt man, the supposed cousin, scoffed. "Nah, he must have wandered off. We've been looking for him." His eyes darted towards the office, where Lucky was now scratching at the door, whining, "Good boy, Buster, come on out." Lucky, hearing a familiar tone perhaps, or just reacting to the sound, barked again. The name Buster didn't seem right, but the puppy's reaction sent a spike of fear through George. "His name's Lucky," George said firmly, "and he's staying here. I found him. I cared for him. He was half dead." The stocky man took a step closer, invading George's space. "Look, old man, we ain't asking. That's our property. We're taking him." George stood his ground. Years of ingrained military discipline, long dormant, surfaced. He didn't raise his voice, didn't betray the fear churning inside him. "You're not taking him anywhere. You abandoned him. That makes him mine now, legally and morally. Now I suggest you leave my property." There was a tense silence. The wind whistled around the corners of the station inside. Lucky continued to whine, confused. Rusty remained a low, growling presence on the counter. The two men exchanged a look. The stocky one flexed his hands. "Maybe you didn't hear me right," the stocky man said menacingly. This was it. The turning point. Before, George was just a caretaker, doing the right thing by a foundling. Now these men were challenging his claim, threatening the fragile peace, threatening Lucky. There was no going back to the way things were. He couldn't just hand Lucky over, not after everything. The thought of Lucky going back to people who would treat him like trash, who would call him Buster with feigned affection, only to discard him again, was unbearable. His role had shifted. He wasn't just reacting anymore. He had to actively protect Lucky. This was his dog now. This was his fight. "I heard you," George said, his voice quiet but hard as nails, "and I said leave now." He held their gaze unflinching. The bluff, the confrontation, the outright claim. It was a point of no return. He had drawn a line in the dust of the Sandhills Serenity Gas and Go. The two men hesitated, clearly surprised by George's unexpected steeliness. The stocky one looked ready to argue, maybe even push, but the gaunt one put a hand on his arm. "Easy, Dale," he muttered, his eyes still fixed on George. "No need for trouble." He gave George a long, calculating look. "This ain't over." Then, without another word, they turned, got back into the pickup, and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and a heavy silence behind them. George watched them go until the truck was a speck on the horizon, his legs suddenly feeling weak. He leaned against the doorframe, taking deep breaths. Inside, Lucky whined anxiously, scratching at the door. Rusty jumped down from the counter and rubbed against George's legs, an unusual gesture of solidarity. George reached down and stroked the cat's orange fur. "Well, Rusty," he sighed, "looks like we got ourselves a situation." The immediate threat was gone, but the confrontation left a bitter taste. George knew they'd be back. Men like that didn't give up easily, especially if they thought they were being defied by an old man living alone in the middle of nowhere. The fragile bubble of peace he'd created felt dangerously thin. Paranoia began to creep in. Every unfamiliar car that slowed down, every late-night sound seemed like a potential threat. He started locking the office door even during the day, keeping Lucky close. He found himself checking the perimeter more often. His old service pistol, long unused, cleaned, and kept within reach in the office desk drawer. A measure that felt both necessary and deeply unsettling. He considered calling the sheriff, but what could he say? 2 men claimed a dog was theirs. He had no proof they were the ones who dumped Lucky. Only his gut feeling and the memory of that night, and he had no proof of ownership himself, other than possession and the story of the rescue. It felt like his word against theirs, and he wasn't sure the law would be on his side without concrete evidence. His worry began to affect his interactions. He became shorter with customers again, his brief period of openness receding. Sleep offered little respite, often interrupted by dreams of the gaunt man's unsettling eyes or the sound of the pickup truck returning in the dead of night. He looked at Lucky, now blissfully unaware, chewing on a rawhide bone George had bought him, and felt a fierce, almost painful wave of protectiveness. He couldn't fail him, but how could one old man and a stray cat stand against determined malice? This was his dark night of the soul. The crushing weight of responsibility, the isolation, the gnawing fear that he wasn't strong enough, that his quiet life was about to be violently disrupted, and that Lucky would pay the price. He thought about the torn piece of paper again, the partial logo, El Cre. He pulled it out of his wallet, smoothing the creased fragment. Maybe it was a clue. He spent an evening searching online, typing variations into the search engine. On the station's slow computer, feed store logo, Elkray, Nebraska, farm supply, Elkray, Campbell Creek. No, Mitchell Creek. Still nothing. Then he tried thinking geographically what towns were within, say, a 50-mile radius. He listed them out. Maxwell, Brady, Gothenburg. Then he saw it on the map. Ansel Creek, a small farming community, about an hour's drive west. Could it be he searched Ansel Creek Feed and Seed? A grainy picture of their storefront popped up, and there it was. The logo on their sign matched the fragment on the paper. A surge of adrenaline shot through him. It wasn't much, but it was something, a connection. These men likely came from Ansel Creek, or at least frequented the feed store there. It didn't prove they dumped Lucky, but it placed them geographically. Maybe someone there knew them, knew about a missing puppy. It felt like a long shot, a desperate grasp at straws, but it was better than waiting passively for them to return. He needed a plan. Going to Ansel Creek himself felt risky. What if he ran into them? What if asking questions just alerted them? He thought about Sheriff Brody in North Platte. Brody was a reasonable man. Maybe he'd listen now with this sliver of potential evidence. But George hesitated. He was used to handling things himself. Asking for help felt like admitting defeat. He spent the next few days fortifying the station in small ways. He fixed the latch on the back gate, replaced the burnt-out bulb over the rear entrance, made sure the phone line was working clearly. He kept Lucky mostly indoors, only letting him out for brief, supervised periods. Rusty seemed to sense the tension sticking closer to George than usual, his orange fur often bristling at unfamiliar sounds. One evening, Big Mike, a trucker who was one of George's most loyal regulars, pulled in for his usual coffee and fuel stop. Mike was a large, imposing man with a booming laugh and a kind heart who had taken a shine to Lucky on previous visits. George, feeling the strain, found himself confiding in Mike, explaining the situation, the threats, the fragment of the receipt. Mike listened intently, his expression growing serious. "Sounds like scum, George. Can't abide people who treat animals that way." He looked towards the office where Lucky was sleeping peacefully. "You need backup. You let me know. I run this route twice a week. I got my CB lots of friends on the road." He paused, then added, "And don't you hesitate to call Sheriff Brody. That's what he's there for. Don't try to be a hero." Mike's words, his offer of support, were a small comfort, but the underlying fear remained. George knew the confrontation was inevitable. The men hadn't made their move yet, but he could feel it coming. It was like the heavy stillness in the air before a prairie thunderstorm. He checked the pistol in the drawer again. He checked the locks. He watched the highway. He waited. The buildup was agonizing, the tension stretching tighter, with each passing day pulling towards a breaking point he knew couldn't be far off. The breaking point arrived 3 days later, under the harsh glare of the midday sun. The blue pickup truck appeared again, rolling slowly down the highway before turning sharply into the station, kicking up gravel. This time, they didn't bother with pretenses. Dale, the stocky one, jumped out before the truck even stopped, a tire iron glinting in his hand. The gaunt cousin, whose name George still didn't know, got out more slowly, his eyes scanning the area with predatory stillness. George was outside checking the air pressure on an old RV that had pulled in earlier. His heart leaped into his throat. Lucky was inside the office, whining at the sound of the familiar truck. Rusty was perched on the RV's steps, washing a paw, seemingly oblivious. "All right, old man," Dale shouted, advancing towards the office. "Playtime's over. We're getting the dog." George moved quickly, intercepting him before he reached the door. "I told you to leave," George said, his voice dangerously low. He could feel the adrenaline coursing through him, a cold fire replacing the fear. "And I told you," Dale sneered, hefting the tire iron. "We ain't asking." The RV owner, a nervous-looking tourist named Herb, quickly retreated into his vehicle, peering out the window. George was on his own. Or was he? Suddenly Rusty streaked down from the RV steps, but instead of attacking the cat, did something utterly unexpected. He shot past the men darting towards the highway, then stopped right at the edge of the asphalt, looking back towards the station, letting out a series of loud, insistent meows. It was bizarre, nonsensical behavior under the circumstances. The gaunt man glanced dismissively at the cat. "Stupid animal!" Dale ignored it completely, raising the tire iron as he took another step towards George, but Rusty's cries were answered. The deep blast of an air horn echoed down the highway. Big Mike's 18-wheeler, gleaming red in the sun, was bearing down on the station much earlier than his usual schedule. He must have heard George's predicament crackling over the CB net from another trucker who'd passed through, or perhaps George's earlier conversation had prompted him to adjust his timing. Seeing the approaching semi, the gaunt man hesitated. "Dale, maybe we should." But Dale was committed. He lunged towards George. George sidestepped, bracing himself, but he knew he couldn't hold him off for long. Just as Dale swung the tire iron, Big Mike laid on the air horn again, the sound deafening as he swerved his massive rig partially into the station entrance, blocking the blue pickup's exit and bathing the scene in the roar of his engine and the intimidating presence of 20 tons of chrome and steel. Mike threw open his cab door, vaulting down the steps. He was even larger, standing next to George. "Problem here, fellas." Mike boomed his voice easily. Cutting through the engine noise, Dale froze the tire iron halfway through its arc. He and his cousin looked from the imposing trucker to George, then at the blocked exit. Their bravado evaporated instantly. "No problem." The gaunt man stammered, already backing towards his trapped pickup. "Just leaving." Dale lowered the tire iron, his face sullen. They scrambled back into their truck. Big Mike stood arms crossed, watching them like a hawk, until they managed to maneuver the pickup awkwardly around the semi and onto the highway, speeding away westward towards Ansel Creek. As the blue pickup disappeared, the tension broke. George leaned heavily against a gas pump, the adrenaline leaving him shaky. Big Mike clapped him on the shoulder. "Told you scum like that fold easy when faced with real trouble, George." He grinned. "And that cat of yours never seen anything like it. Looked like he was flagging me down." George looked over at Rusty, who was now calmly grooming himself near the office door as if nothing had happened. Maybe he had been flagging Mike down in his own feline way, or maybe it was just a coincidence amplified by the stressful situation. Either way, George felt a profound sense of gratitude towards the orange tabby. Herb, the RV owner, cautiously emerged. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine now," George assured him, managing a weak smile. He went inside, scooped up a trembling Lucky, and held him close. "It's okay, boy. They're gone." Lucky licked his face frantically, his tail thumping against George's arm. Later that day, George did call Sheriff Brody. He recounted the entire story from finding Lucky near death to the confrontation and Big Mike's intervention. He mentioned the Ansel Creek connection and the feed store receipt. Sheriff Brody listened patiently. "All right, George," he said, "abandonment threats. We can definitely look into these fellas in Ansel Creek. Give me their description and the trucks. Maybe we can ensure they don't bother you again." Weeks turned into months. The Sandhills' serenity. Gas and Go returned to its usual quiet rhythm, but it was a different kind of quiet now. It was filled with the soft padding of Rusty's paws, the click-clack of Lucky's claws on the linoleum floor, and George's own voice softer and more frequent than before. Lucky grew rapidly, a bundle of boundless energy and affection, inseparable from both George and Rusty. The bond between the unlikely trio solidified into a true family. Sheriff Brody eventually called back. The two men had been identified. They had a history of minor offenses and animal neglect complaints in Ansel Creek. While proving the initial abandonment was difficult, the threats George reported, corroborated by Big Mike, were enough for the sheriff to pay them a serious visit. Strongly advising them to stay far away from George's station, they were never seen again. George finally fixed the fence behind the station, creating a safe grassy area for Lucky to run. He even put up a small hand-painted sign by the office door: "George, Lucky, and Rusty, proprietors." Life wasn't just enduring anymore, It had found a measure of contentment, even joy sparked by a near-dead puppy, and the unthinkable actions of a stray orange cat who decided against all odds to care. The vast, indifferent plains still stretched out around them, but inside the small station there was warmth, loyalty, and the quiet serenity they had finally earned.